Greetings and welcome to another discussion with the writer Fred. My guest today, to my far right, is Dr. Richard Gambetta, Dr. Rudy Rosales, and Miss Gigi Hughes. They've all been on this show before. Today we're going to take under consideration the issue of desegregating the public schools. As you all know, in May 1954, the United States Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, decided that Plessy versus Ferguson should be overruled because separate was not equal, and therefore called for the desegregation of public schools with all deliberate speed. 63 years later, we find that this really hasn't happened, and that's what we want to discuss today, some of the reasons why, and maybe look at possibly some of the remedies. So I'm going to start today with Dr. Gambetta. Dr. Gambetta, scholars like Derek Bell and civil rights activists have, as well as supporters of separatism, have argued that the remedy in the Brown versus Board of Education shouldn't have called for desegregating public schools, but instead a more equal distribution of the resources. Are they correct in their assertion?
Well, they're half right, I think. It's Derek Bell's position is a complex one, but he was saying that really it's the distribution of the resources that count towards the educational quality of individuals, regardless of race. And a maldistribution, an unequal distribution, is going to favor one set of students over others. And that historically has been dedicated to whites rather than blacks. And Bell's position, and who I studied with at NYU, Bell's position was that the court got it half right, that desegregation was okay, but they screwed up. They got it half right and half-assed in the implementation component of desegregation, where they said that one must desegregate with all deliberate speed, and which translated into a lot of deliberation and very little speed. Right. There was no speed in desegregation. The white racist South, in particular, stopped it. And Bell started his career by overseeing for the NAACP hundreds of desegregation cases for school districts, and became frustrated because he saw the impediments towards progress under the Brown decision. So Bell said basically they should have retained Sweatt versus Painter from 1950, which said that if you're going to operate under Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal system, that there has to be equality, separate and equal. So he's saying that really it was the distribution of the resources, giving equal resources to the separate schools would have been better than what Brown versus the Board of Education actually did. And Brown was not the holy grail, except symbolically. And that blacks had only moved up in his thesis in Silent Covenant in two manners. One is where what he called racial sacrifice, where whites had a secret covenant, a secret agreement to sacrifice the rights of blacks, such as in the creation and adoption of the United States Constitution, with the preservation of slavery as the compromise that got the constitutional moving ratified and accepted. And secondly, where there is an interest convergence among whites, so that white conflicting values and interests would merge and decide what was best for whites would be to give some additional rights to blacks, such as during the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement. The Cold War was the real reason because the Soviet Union was broadcasting throughout Eastern Europe. The U.S. calls itself a democracy focused on equality, and it's not. They have segregated schools, for God's sakes, and treat blacks in an inferior situation.
Right, yeah. What was Sweatt v. Painter? Could you just mention what that was?
Yeah, Sweatt v. Painter focused on the University of Texas School of Law and the racist attitudes of Texas at the time in the regions of segregating the schools. And they operated under Plessy versus Ferguson, and they did not allow any blacks into being admitted into University of Texas Law School of Law. Sweatt was fully qualified in every manner for admission, except for one factor, is that he was black. and therefore he was denied admission. Sweatt sued the University of Texas system, and ultimately was victorious, because they said if you're going to operate, the Supreme Court said, if you're going to operate under separate and equal, you got to have equal resources. Texas tried to create a half-hearted, with no real finances, no building, really, no faculty, a couple of faculty, compared to the prestigious University of Texas faculty and resources. And they said no one could consider this equal. And so therefore they said, if you're going to operate that way, you have to put equal resources into black schools, not simply law school, but other black schools. And Texas was not able to do that. They were not willing to do that, and so therefore they admitted Sweatt and others into the School of Law. It ultimately led to a desegregation, but it ultimately forced an equal distribution of laws. Bell said that would have been a better route than the symbolic victory of Brown versus Board of Education.
Right. Speaking on the resources, Dr. Rosales, San Antonio is a perfect example of attempts by financially rich communities to keep the money for their local schools through the creation of separate school boards serving their particular area. Should there be only one school board in the city of San Antonio to assure an equal distribution of the resources?
I think that's a very important question, because it addresses a hidden issue within this question of education, and that is governance. It's one thing for people to give you access to education, it's another thing to control your education, right? And that's what they started out with anyway, back then, right? Two good examples, one out of literature and the other one right here in Texas, in Del Rio, Texas, when they desegregated, they had San Felipe School District and they had Del Rio School District. Del Rio was for the white students and San Felipe was for the Mexican students. And talking to a lot of these people, they said, we felt real comfortable in San Felipe. And then they integrated us, and they treated us like shit. I mean, excuse my language, all of a sudden we're alienated, we're not in our world, we don't control it, there's nothing, in other words, governance, right? Governance over your own body, governance over your own system, governance over the process itself, right? A second example points right directly to what you said. Ira Katznelson wrote this book, City Trenches. And using kind of a Gramscian approach to structure and agency, what he argued was that in Long Island, when they broke down the system and allowed the different communities to control their schools, what they did was they pulled off resources and they began to fight over resources and fight with each other, so that you had them pitted against each other instead of saying, hey, we want a better education for our children.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't want to go into conspiracy theories, right? But this whole thing about how you pit people against people, it has to do with structure. It has to do, and this structure has to do with the most important. There's two issues that are facing us even today that are critically important. That's education and health. Period, right? Because without health, of course, you can't study. Without health, you can't work. Without health, but without education, right? What do you have? And so if we line up all the children and throw them into Page Middle School over here on the south side and tell them to shut up and do what they have to do, they'll rebel. And I've seen it. I've been subbing down there. I've seen it. They don't take anything, right? And they're all blaming each other, and the children come from backgrounds that are not very conducive to being, scholarly. They're poor, they lack resources. Some of them come from single parents. So my argument is that we miss the whole ballpark, but I don't know if there's any real solution. That's why I kind of feel kind of depressed telling you that, because I don't know if there's any real solution, because to me, education has to do with governance. And we have to govern our resources, etc. Right? You asked me, should we pull one body together?
Right.
Well, I mean, maybe or maybe not. What about creating a fund that goes to each school district, period, and each school district controls its education, its curriculum, its You know, they can be creative, they can do things, and that would be it, right? But you have to remember also, after all these years of segregation, right, some communities are way behind. And who was it, Mulder for IDRA pointed out, look, it's not just about equalizing resources now, because we would have to double up and triple up the resources just to catch up.
Just to catch up, yeah.
Right? So it's a complicated question. I zero in on governance, because a community that produces itself empowers itself.
Okay.
Controlling one's own destiny.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. Yeah. Gigi, I want to move a little away from the resources question to talk about the battle that's been waging for a while between the idea that charter schools are replacing, as Randy Weingarten calls it, the polite cousin of segregation, and that it's just a way to segregate the children again by having the charter schools. Others will argue that what charter schools are doing is pulling resources away from the public schools. I know our very distinguished principal at Sam Houston High School, Dr. Mateen Diop, has written a book about the problem that charter schools creates for public schools. What's your feeling on that? How do you feel about that?
I don't necessarily fully agree that charter schools is that much of the problem as the public school is, because I've looked at the successes
Raise your
of
voice
both.
a little.
I've looked at the success from both. In public schools now we have ever so popular the prison, the pipeline. And what happens in elementary school is you have teachers that are just not culturally connected with, say, Tyrone or Bebe. So he starts to get written up in school every day. By the time Tyrone makes it to middle school and they're looking at his folder, this teacher that's not culturally connected to Tyrone, they're looking at this misbehavior.
Right.
So middle school then sends him to juvie.
Okay.
Okay, so when he goes to juvie camp or prison, I call it little boy's prison,
Okay.
he's then released and he's angry. So from the age of 17 to 23 years old, there's some mishap in his life because now he's tossed back in public school and they're totally not understanding Tyrone. And then he's put in the real person's prison. So that's my issue with public schools.
Okay.
With charter schools, there's not enough given, but I have seen a success in both.
Okay. Okay. You know, when you talk about culturally connected, I had a discussion one time with the chair of the education department at UTSA, and I suggested that some of the teachers need to understand the kids that they're going to teach in our communities, because they don't. They don't. Anger in a black child or argumentative behavior in a black child often is a way of showing love. But to a
Anglo
person,
teacher, young, never had any
God,
children,
yeah,
not
I
experienced.
got this angry student. What can I
Right.
do with them? And they don't understand them. And I suggested maybe UTSA needs to come up with a class. If you're going to take a young white graduate and put her in the
No
middle of the-
children, no family understanding.
How
none of
could she
that.
deal with that child?
Exactly.
Yeah.
All of this is connected to basic education and to schools and community. And the traditional conflict of values has always been between local control, which is always a positive, and equality. The whole idea of public education is to give a semblance of equality, equal opportunity to children to learn. But what happens when you look at society from its development? It originally was, even into the 1950s and 60s and later, there was restrictive racial covenants in the deeds of properties that blacks, as one example, Mexican Americans as another, and others, could not move into particular neighborhoods.
Right.
which meant that they could not move out of certain neighborhoods too. Colonialism was used before, but there was segregation in the housing patterns. Now look, and when you're tying education, it ties to economic status with the funding of the education. So if you live in a poverty area, historically, it was property taxes which funded the educational opportunities of children so that the affluent areas could fund at a much higher rate. In San Antonio, you brought up the example of San Antonio, which is one of the top 5 cities in the country in terms of economic segregation. But we know that economic segregation translates into racial segregation and the lack of desegregation, the lack of integration. But to a middle class, to a suburban family, a middle class family, what's the greatest asset of that family? It basically is their house and the appreciation of that house over one lifetime, over another lifetime, over another lifetime, so that wealth grows. In poverty neighborhoods, it's depreciation because there is not reinvestment. Right. And so there is not that growth of economic household wealth in the poorer areas. As far as jobs, if you move from housing to jobs, what, you look at, well, one school district is performing at a certain level on the tests, one school district is pipelined, a good term, pipelined into college, another, the other community is pipelined, if not to prison, or if not to prison, if there's an exceptional student who has played the game and learned the lessons, it's to community college, which the person has to struggle to get the funding and work part-time, right, at least, if not full-time, to pay for the education at a community college, and then perhaps go to a regular college. But then historically, it's the prestigious colleges that will get the best jobs, and there's a tracking that takes place. If you take 2 children, both equally gifted, and you place them into different school systems and in different housing, and the housing makes a difference, not simply in the accumulation of wealth, but there's psychological tests now, sociological tests, that show the better the quality of the housing, separate from the love of the family on the child, the quality of the infrastructure of the housing has an effect upon the performance in school. That's a serious commentary. But you've got jobs with the economic discrimination that takes place, and the racial discrimination on top of that, and then we won't even talk at this point about gender inequalities as a third component upon that, and discrimination associated with that. There's a double or triple whammy against children that are born in poverty areas, with jobs, with housing, and with economic uplift over time.
Right. To expand on that, try to remember his name. He did a really interesting theoretical look at the city. And what he argued was that your income is not the only thing that is measured in terms of who you are. It's where you live. It's the amenities you have there, the parks. It's the safety. It's like the police will come by and they'll say, "Howdy," right? Police come by in another neighborhood and say, "Oh shit," hi, right? I mean, it's a reality.
Yes, it is.
Right? And I think that part of the psychological balance that occurs is this, and it's even more dangerous, and that is that kids grow up in these areas where they don't know what the other world is like,
Right.
and they get used to this is reality.
Right.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
I was a volunteer at the Boys Club over there in the West Side on 19th Street, and there were some kids that had never gotten out of a 5-block area there.
Yes.
Ever. Some of them did well, okay? I mean, they went to high school, and they got a job, and they did everything. But that was it. They were trapped in that role.
Right.
And they didn't see that over here, if you go to the other schools up on the north side, you got computers.
State-of-the-art
swimming, an Olympic swimming pool. You got, I mean, the school that you were telling me about, the school where you can go through an all Spanish school all the way through what grade? 8th. All the way through the 8th grade. Kids in the north side can go in and come out bilingual. Right? And the kids over there in the west side and the south side, they come out not knowing English or Spanish,
Right, yeah.
right?
Yeah. that's-
Functionally.
Right,
Functionally,
yeah,
I mean, they
functionally
can
illiterate.
communicate, they're intelligent people, but it's like a lack of resources, and they don't know it. They
Right.
don't know
They
they're
don't.
getting robbed.
And on
That's
top
the
of-
worst
On
part,
top of
right?
all that, the studies show that who you go to school with makes a difference. That if you go with the sons and daughters of bankers, you know, you're going to have friends that ultimately you may have an entry into the banking industry for a job. If you don't, if you go to where a large number of the people are incarcerated or involved in illicit activities, you're not going to have the network
Right,
of uplift. So even things like that make a difference. And so the failure to desegregate and to allow an avenue towards economic opportunity and housing opportunities in other parts of the city has been destructive of the black community. And Mexican.
2 more minutes, let me just say.
Go right ahead, yes.
I have this, I approach community with this particular theoretical framework that I'm developing, and it's about production as the basis of everything. If a community can reproduce its own self, it empowers itself.
Yes.
If a community is exposed to all the other outside forces, they draw their children here, draw over here, they have nothing in the end.
Right.
They don't have empowerment, right?
Right.
I would argue that even a community, a poor community in the deep south side, the east side, or west side, if they were to begin to reproduce themselves, they would empower themselves. What do I mean by reproduce?
Right.
I have this dream that I want to develop a symphony in the south side. And I want the community to own it. I don't want a do-gooder to own it from the outside. I want them to own it. And once they begin to own that symphony, they begin to reproduce their children. They begin to reproduce who they are. And once they begin to reproduce themselves, they become empowered. And I know it's idealistic, but it's a theoretical thing that I've been working on for a long, long, long time, right? And that has to do everything. That can then counter these problems in education in a large, large way, because then they can begin to demand what they want for their children in education in other areas.
You know, you talk about the governance being important, and I agree with you, but the governance depends on the finances, doesn't it?
You know, basically, educational disadvantages translate into economic disadvantages. Economic disadvantages translate into political disadvantages.
Yes.
Political disadvantages translate back into educational and economic
And so it
disadvantages.
So it's a cycle.
Transitory Mundi and West.
So you got to break it out of it. You got to break out of it.
Yeah, the question is, how do you break out of it? Yeah, how do you break, yeah.
You reproduce yourself
You reproduce yourself. Okay.
as a community. Not as an individual. I argue that citizenship, did I say shit? Citizenship outside community is an illusion because you have no power as an individual. And so if you happen to be white, you get the privileges and the benefits of it, but it's not your power, right? If you happen to be black or African American or Native American, outside the community, you don't have anything,
Right, yeah.
right? And so illusion, I think, I mean, citizenship is then a community thing, and it always has been. James Madison argued that in his Federalist Papers. He didn't want the working class or the small shopkeepers to vote, because those were communities that were going to vote against what they wanted.
And he sure didn't want the African Americans, Mexican Americans, or women.
Thank you.
Vote.
Thank you, yeah.
At all.
Well, that's, the whole idea of community that comes into play.
Right. You mentioned something about territorial, and it reminds me of my years on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. What struck me is kids coming on Capitol Hill, going through the Capitol, white kids would go through there like they own it. I mean, like, I belong here, you know, this is mine. 3 blocks away, black kids lived, and they never
Never see
step
it,
foot
yeah.
in the Capitol.
Yeah.
Because their territory is right here, and they've been,
It's us and them.
it's, yeah, and that doesn't, I can't go there. You better not come here, but I can't go there. And it seems to me, isn't that one of the problems that our kids confront, this thinking that this is...
Racial profiling when they're in different communities.
Well, not so much...
Because if I go, no, today,
Okay.
if I drive over in Alamo Heights to look at the Christmas lights, and my car is not, it's not a Lamborghini, but if I take my children, we're gonna get pulled over by the police when we're leaving that area. Or we're asked, what are you doing here? Well, because, I'm not a criminal. I'll say, why? And one thing leads to another.
Right,
But
yeah.
white children can come over and look at go to the Alamo Dome,
Right.
the AT&T Center.
Because they think
perfectly
it-
fine,
yeah.
but we're not, what are you doing here? Where are you going? Why? Those things, it's the things that keep black children confined in their area of stay.
Guilty of driving while black.
Yes, or even walking now.
Walking while,
Yeah.
Well, let's get back to the original question that Derek Bell threw out to us. Should the court not have called for desegregation, but did something differently? Should they have gone after, and how could they have forced that, as we're finding out from the Supreme Court case?
They were half right, and then in 1973, in San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez, again, San Antonio at the heart of this litigation that has lasted since '73. But the Supreme Court divided 5-4 with 5 Republican justices, 4 of which had been named by the Nixon administration, elected in '68. But 5-4 Republicans, the 5 Republicans voting, that one, education was not a fundamental right because it's not explicitly or implicitly written in the text of the Constitution. And therefore it doesn't activate what's called strict scrutiny in constitutional laws. And secondly, that there was no suspect class in constitutional terms. There was no class that was suspicious as far as discrimination against. They said there's no cohesive class here that sticks together. Like you can tell a class of blacks and a class of whites, they're 2 separate classes. But this, in a poor school, in a rich and poor school districts, is really a class situation. And the Supreme Court said, well, there's some poor kids that live in rich public school districts, and some rich kids that live in poor school districts. And San Antonio is a good example of that. There was, as an example, in Alamo Heights, there was Cement City, where the now quarry is, where there was a labor camp, basically, to put it bluntly, a labor camp of people that lived there, and which worked the mines, the mining operations at the quarry, and rock splitting at the quarry, and their kids went to Alamo Heights. So they say it's not a unique, cohesive class because it contains all different types of income brackets, and it's not rich and poor. They aren't writing it explicitly in the law that said no poor kid can get school finance, but rather it's geographically based. Well, the geographical base is related to economic conditions, and the economic conditions are related to race because of the historical context out of which it grows.
Okay, we're about to wrap up here, so let me give each of you maybe 30 seconds to make a final comment. Let's start over here with Gigi.
Our question was regarding desegregation and the separate but equal.
The whole idea was, why has desegregation failed, and was desegregation the best way for us to go instead of an equal distribution of the
It's failed,
resources?
okay. It's failed because of the financing.
Okay.
The equal financing in all the schools.
Okay. So would you take, I'm sorry, go
They
ahead.
said they were going to make it, equal. It never has been.
Okay,
Neither will it ever be. I don't think so.
okay. Dr. Rosales, you want to close out with a comment?
It's a really difficult question because I continue to think along empowerment, the question of empowerment, because if a community has power, they're not gonna mess with you. political power I'm talking about. I'm not talking about violence or anything else. I'm talking about political power. They know what they're doing. And I'm thinking, how do we undo this mess and look at how communities begin to develop? And how do we then place that in the context of an equal educational system where people have access to educate their children?
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Because after all, we do live in this society, and therefore, we have to work within that system, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So, I don't know, that's...
Difficult question.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. You said
Dr. Gambetta, you want
I think
to
the real problem, and quickly stated, is the financing. I agree with Gigi on that. There was not equal financing of educational opportunity for students, and that has translated into a lack of economic opportunity, which is translated into a lack of political opportunity, which translates back into maldistribution of the economic resources in our society.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for joining us today, and I want to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in, and I invite you to tune in to the next session with the writer Fred.